The construction site hummed with the sounds of progress. Bulldozers churned through piles of dirt, and the steady clang of metal on rock echoed in the background. Emma Carter, the lead site manager, walked briskly across the gravel, clipboard in hand. Her sharp eyes darted from one corner of the site to the other, ensuring everything was running smoothly. "Hey, Jake, did you check the drainage trench near the south end?" Emma called out, her voice rising above the noise. "Checked it twice, boss," Jake replied, wiping the sweat off his forehead. "Nothing but dirt and debris down there." Emma nodded, but just as she turned to review her notes, a faint, high-pitched sound stopped her in her tracks. It was barely audible over the machinery, but it pierced through the din like a needle. "Jake, hold on," Emma said, raising her hand to silence him. "Do you hear that?" Jake tilted his head, his expression shifting from confusion to curiosity. The sound came again, soft, plaintive, almost like a cry. "Yeah, I hear it," Jake said, his voice tense. "What is that?" "Kill the engines." Emma shouted to the crew, and one by one, the machines rumbled to a halt. The sudden silence was almost eerie, broken only by the faint whimpering that seemed to rise from the freshly dug excavation pit nearby. "It's coming from over there," Emma said, pointing. "Let's check it out." Emma led the way, her boots crunching against the gravel as Jake and two other workers followed closely. They approached the edge of the pit, which stretched about 10 feet deep. At first, all they could see was a mess of mud, rocks, and broken debris from the morning's dig. Then something moved. "Did you see that?" Jake asked, his voice rising with excitement. Emma squinted, her gaze locking onto a small, trembling figure partially hidden by a chunk of plywood. Its tiny body was coated in thick mud, making it almost indistinguishable from the surrounding muck. "What is it?" one of the workers murmured. "Looks like a puppy," another said. Emma frowned, her instincts telling her otherwise. The shape of the creature was unusual, its limbs too slender, its body too compact. But whatever it was alive, and it was in trouble. "We're not leaving it there," Emma said firmly. "Jake, grab the tarp from the truck. And someone bring me gloves and a harness. We need to do this carefully." The crew sprang into action, retrieving the supplies as Emma assessed the situation. The pit walls were unstable, and one wrong move could trigger a collapse. She tied the harness around her waist and signaled for the team to lower her down. As she descended into the pit, the earthy smell of wet soil filled her nose. The faint cries grew louder, tugging at her heart. Emma moved cautiously, her boots sinking slightly into the mud with each step. When she reached the creature, she knelt down, her gloved hands outstretched. "Hey there," she whispered gently. "It's okay. I'm here to help." The small figure flinched but didn't try to move away. Emma carefully draped the tarp over it, bundling its fragile body with deliberate care. "Got it," she called up to the team. "Pull me up, nice and slow." The workers held their breath as they hoisted Emma and the bundle out of the pit. Once she was safely on solid ground, she unwrapped the tarp just enough to get a closer look at the creature. "It's so tiny," Jake said, peering over her shoulder. The creature's fur, or what little of it could be seen under the mud, was matted and dull. Its small body trembled violently, and its whimpering grew softer, as if it were too exhausted to cry anymore. "Definitely not a dog," Emma said, her brows knitting together. "But I can't tell what it is either." "What do we do now?" one of the workers asked. "We take it to the wildlife clinic," Emma said without hesitation. "Whatever it is, it needs help. Let's not waste any time." The team worked quickly, securing the tarp bundle in the back of a truck. As Emma climbed into the passenger seat, she cast one last glance at the small figure. Despite its fragile appearance, there was something resilient about it, something that hinted at a story yet to unfold. As the truck rumbled down the dirt road, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to uncover something far more extraordinary than they had imagined. The drive to the wildlife clinic was tense. The small bundle sat on the seat beside Emma, wrapped tightly in the tarp to keep it warm. Every so often, the creature let out a soft whimper, its frail body trembling beneath the layers of mud and fabric. Jake kept his hands firmly on the wheel, stealing glances at Emma as she monitored the little figure. "You really think it's not a dog?" he asked, his voice breaking the silence. Emma shook her head. "I don't know what it is, Jake. It's just, there's something about it. The shape, the size, it doesn't add up. But that doesn't matter right now. All that matters is getting it help." The truck bumped along the gravel road, the clinic sign finally coming into view. Nestled at the edge of a wooded area, the small building was a haven for injured and displaced wildlife. As soon as they arrived, Emma and Jake carried the bundle inside. The receptionist, a kind-looking woman in her early 50s, stood up immediately. "Can I help you?" she asked, her eyes darting to the tarp in Emma's arms. "We found this animal," Emma said, hesitating briefly. "It's in bad shape. We're not sure what it is, but it needs attention." The receptionist nodded, picking up the phone. "I'll get Dr. Mason. He's our wildlife specialist." Moments later, a tall man in scrubs emerged from the back room. His hands were gloved, and his expression was calm but curious. "Let's see what we've got here," Dr. Mason said, gesturing for Emma to place the bundle on a nearby examination table. The clinic room was bright and sterile, the faint smell of antiseptic hanging in the air. Emma unwrapped the tarp carefully, revealing the mud-coated creature within. Dr. Mason leaned in, his eyes narrowing as he examined the small, trembling form. "This isn't a dog," he murmured after a moment. "I can tell you that much." "What is it?" Jake asked, his voice filled with both curiosity and concern. Dr. Mason didn't answer immediately. Instead, he began the delicate process of cleaning the creature. Using warm water and a soft cloth, he gently wiped away the thick layers of mud. With each stroke, more of the animal's true appearance came into view. The room fell silent as the mud revealed a small, sleek body covered in reddish-brown fur. The creature's ears, pointed and slightly too large for its head, twitched faintly. Its sharp, delicate features became more pronounced, and its amber eyes blinked weakly as it looked around. "It's a red fox," Dr. Mason finally said, his voice tinged with surprise. "A juvenile. Probably only a few months old." "A fox?" Emma repeated, her eyes widening. "What's it doing in the middle of a construction site?" Dr. Mason shook his head. "Hard to say. It's not uncommon for young foxes to get separated from their mothers, especially if their den is disturbed. But this one's lucky you found it when you did. It wouldn't have survived much longer." Jake let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned. I thought for sure it was some kind of stray dog." Dr. Mason continued his examination, checking the fox's vital signs and looking for injuries. "It's malnourished and dehydrated," he said, his tone serious. "And it's got a few cuts and scrapes, but nothing life-threatening. With proper care, it should recover." Emma felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had been prepared for the worst, but hearing that the little fox had a chance gave her hope. "What happens now?" she asked. "We'll start with fluids and antibiotics," Dr. Mason replied. "After that, it's all about nutrition and rest. It'll take some time, but I think this one's a fighter." Emma glanced at the small creature, which had curled into a tight ball on the table. Despite its fragile state, there was a quiet strength in its tiny frame. Before leaving, Emma and Jake stayed to watch as the fox was settled into a clean enclosure lined with soft blankets. Dr. Mason placed a shallow dish of water nearby, and the little fox sniffed at it cautiously before taking a few sips. "What should we call it?" Jake asked, leaning against the wall. Emma smiled faintly. "Bruce," she said after a moment. "It seems fitting." "Bruce?" Jake echoed, raising an eyebrow. "It's strong," Emma explained. "And this little one is definitely a fighter." Jake nodded, a grin spreading across his face. "All right, Bruce, it is." As they left the clinic, Emma couldn't help but feel a sense of connection to the small fox they had rescued. The thought of Bruce fighting for survival, despite the odds, resonated with her in a way she couldn't quite explain. Back in the truck, Jake broke the silence. "You know, Emma, it's not every day we get to do something like this. Feels good, doesn't it?" Emma nodded, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. "Yeah, Jake. It really does." Though the day had started like any other, it was clear that this discovery would leave a lasting impact, not just on Bruce, but on everyone who had been part of the rescue. The days following Bruce's arrival at the wildlife clinic were filled with quiet anticipation. Emma found herself thinking about the small fox more often than she expected. Despite her demanding schedule at the construction site, she made time to check in with the clinic, eager for updates on Bruce's condition. "You've been asking about that fox a lot," Jake teased one morning as they reviewed site plans. "Getting attached?" Emma smirked but didn't deny it. "Let's just say I like to see things through. Bruce deserves a chance, and I want to make sure he gets it." At the clinic, Bruce was slowly beginning to recover. Dr. Mason's team worked tirelessly, ensuring the fox received the best care possible. The fluids and antibiotics had helped stabilize Bruce, but it was clear that the journey to full recovery would be a long one. The little fox spent most of its time curled up in its enclosure, resting and regaining strength. Occasionally, it would lift its head and glance around with cautious curiosity, its amber eyes reflecting a mix of fear and resilience. Emma stopped by the clinic whenever she could, often bringing Jake along. During one visit, they arrived just in time to see Bruce being fed for the first time since the rescue. Dr. Mason greeted them at the door, his expression lighter than it had been during their previous visits. "Good timing," he said. "Bruce is about to have his first solid meal." Emma and Jake followed him to the back room, where Bruce's enclosure had been set up. A shallow bowl of carefully prepared food sat inside, and the little fox sniffed at it cautiously. "Is that meat?" Jake asked, leaning closer to the glass. "Ground turkey, to be exact," Dr. Mason replied. "Easy on the stomach and full of nutrients." They watched in silence as Bruce took a tentative bite, his small jaws working to chew the food. It was a simple moment, but it felt monumental. "He's a fighter," Emma said softly, her eyes fixed on the fox. Dr. Mason nodded. "You're right about that. Not all animals in his condition would make it this far." Over the next few weeks, Bruce's progress became the highlight of Emma's routine. Each visit to the clinic brought new milestones: the first time Bruce stood without wobbling, the first time he wagged his tail, the first time he barked, a high-pitched, playful sound that made the entire clinic staff smile. "He's getting his spirit back," Dr. Mason remarked during one visit. Jake chuckled. "You mean he's getting feisty?" It was true. Bruce had started showing signs of typical fox behavior, playfully nipping at the hands of his caretakers and pouncing on toys placed in his enclosure. The transformation was remarkable. Despite the joy of seeing Bruce recover, there were moments of tension. One afternoon, Emma received a call from the clinic that made her heart sink. "It's Dr. Mason," the voice on the other end said. "We've had a bit of a setback." Emma didn't hesitate. She dropped everything and drove to the clinic, her mind racing with worry. When she arrived, Dr. Mason explained that Bruce had developed an infection in one of the cuts on his leg. "We caught it early," he assured her. "But it's a reminder of how delicate his condition still is." Emma approached Bruce's enclosure, her heart aching at the sight of the little fox lying still, his usual energy replaced by fatigue. "You've come this far," she whispered. "Don't give up now, Bruce." Dr. Mason and his team adjusted Bruce's treatment plan, and after a tense few days, the infection subsided. The scare only strengthened Emma's resolve to see Bruce through to the end. "You care a lot about this fox," Dr. Mason commented one evening as Emma helped clean Bruce's enclosure. Emma paused, considering his words. "I guess I do," she admitted. "It's hard not to. He's tougher than he looks. Reminds me that even the smallest things can have the biggest fight in them." Dr. Mason smiled. "It's people like you who make all the difference. Bruce is lucky to have someone rooting for him." As Bruce continued to grow stronger, the conversation began to shift toward his eventual release. Dr. Mason explained that foxes like Bruce were best suited for life in the wild and that keeping him in captivity long-term would go against his nature. "He's doing well," Dr. Mason said during a meeting with Emma and Jake. "But he's not meant to stay here forever. Once he's ready, we'll need to find a suitable release site." The idea of letting Bruce go was bittersweet. Emma had grown attached to the little fox, and the thought of not seeing him again was hard to accept. But she knew it was the right thing to do. "He belongs out there," she said, her voice steady. "And we'll make sure he gets there." By the end of the month, Bruce was almost unrecognizable from the fragile creature Emma had pulled from the mud. His coat had grown thick and glossy, and his playful demeanor had won over everyone at the clinic. "He's ready," Dr. Mason announced one afternoon, holding up a clean bill of health. The news was met with a mix of excitement and sadness. The team began making arrangements for Bruce's release, scouting a nearby wildlife reserve where he could thrive. Emma spent one last evening with Bruce before the big day, sitting quietly by his enclosure as he played with a stuffed toy. "You've come a long way, Bruce," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I'm so proud of you." Bruce paused, tilting his head as if he understood her words. It was a moment of connection that Emma knew she would never forget. The morning of Bruce's release arrived with a crisp chill in the air. The wildlife reserve was a short drive from the clinic, and the team worked meticulously to prepare for the journey. Emma, Jake, and Dr. Mason gathered near Bruce's enclosure, their excitement tempered by the weight of what lay ahead. Bruce had become a symbol of resilience, not just for the clinic staff, but for Emma and her construction crew. Watching him grow stronger had reminded them all of the importance of care and second chances. "Everything ready?" Emma asked, glancing at Dr. Mason, who was double-checking the transport carrier. "Ready as we'll ever be," he replied, securing the latches on the sturdy cage. Inside, Bruce sat quietly, his amber eyes scanning his surroundings. He seemed calm, but Emma could sense the flicker of nervous energy beneath his poised demeanor. Jake leaned over to look at Bruce. "You think he knows what's happening?" Emma smiled faintly. "Maybe. Animals are smarter than we give them credit for." Dr. Mason nodded. "He's ready for this. We've done everything we can to prepare him." The drive to the reserve was a mixture of quiet reflection and hopeful anticipation. Bruce occasionally shifted in his carrier, letting out soft noises that seemed almost like questions. Emma found herself talking to him, her voice steady and reassuring. "It's a beautiful place, Bruce," she said. "You're going to love it out there. Open fields, trees, fresh air, it's where you belong." Jake chuckled from the driver's seat. "You know, you're starting to sound like a parent sending their kid off to college." Emma laughed, but there was truth in Jake's words. The bond she had formed with Bruce was deeper than she had anticipated, and the thought of letting him go was bittersweet. When they arrived at the reserve, a wildlife specialist named Dana greeted them. She had been coordinating with Dr. Mason to ensure Bruce's release went smoothly. "The site is perfect," Dana explained as they walked toward a secluded area of the reserve. "It's far from human activity, with plenty of natural shelter and a healthy food supply. He'll have everything he needs to thrive." Emma carried the carrier, her hands steady despite the lump forming in her throat. As they reached the designated release spot, she set the carrier down gently and knelt beside it. "All right, Bruce," she said softly. "This is it." Dr. Mason opened the carrier door, stepping back to give Bruce space. For a moment, the little fox remained still, his body tense as he peered out at the unfamiliar terrain. The group held their breath, waiting to see what he would do. Slowly, Bruce stepped out onto the grass, his paws sinking into the cool earth. He sniffed the air, his ears twitching as he took in the sounds of the forest. "He's exploring," Dana whispered, her voice tinged with awe. Bruce moved cautiously at first, each step deliberate. Then, as if a switch had flipped, he broke into a light trot, his tail wagging as he ventured further from the group. The moment was both beautiful and heartbreaking. Emma felt a surge of pride watching Bruce embrace his new environment, but the reality of saying goodbye weighed heavily on her. "You did good, Bruce," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "You're going to be amazing out here." As Bruce disappeared into the underbrush, the group stood in silence, letting the moment sink in. Dana finally broke the quiet, her tone reassuring. "He'll be fine," she said. "Foxes are incredibly adaptable. He's got a strong chance." Emma nodded, wiping a tear from the corner of her eye. "I know. It's just hard to let go." The drive back to the clinic was quieter than the journey to the reserve. Jake occasionally glanced at Emma, sensing her reflective mood. "You all right?" he asked gently. Emma smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yeah. I'm just thinking about everything. About how this all started. It's crazy, isn't it? Finding him in that pit, not knowing what he was. And now, seeing him run free, it's almost surreal." Jake nodded. "You gave him a chance he wouldn't have had otherwise. That's something to be proud of." Back at the clinic, Dr. Mason and his team began tidying up the space Bruce had once occupied. The enclosure felt strangely empty, a stark reminder of the little fox who had brought so much life to the room. "Things will feel different without him around," Dr. Mason said, his voice thoughtful. Emma placed a hand on his shoulder. "But that's the point, right? He's where he's meant to be now. That's what matters." Dr. Mason smiled. "You're right. And you were a big part of making that happen." In the days that followed, Emma returned to her work at the construction site with a renewed sense of purpose. The experience with Bruce had reminded her of the importance of compassion and the impact of even the smallest actions. Her crew noticed the change in her demeanor. She was more patient, more willing to listen, and more attuned to the people around her. "You're different," Jake remarked one afternoon as they reviewed blueprints. "Different how?" Emma asked, raising an eyebrow. Jake shrugged. "I don't know. More grounded, I guess. Whatever that fox did to you, it worked." Emma laughed, shaking her head. "Maybe Bruce taught me more than I taught him." The weeks following Bruce's release were filled with a strange mix of emptiness and fulfillment for Emma. She thought often of the little fox, wondering how he was adapting to his new life in the wild. Every now and then, she'd catch herself looking out at the woods near the construction site, imagining Bruce darting between the trees. At the wildlife clinic, Dr. Mason and his team shared updates on Bruce's progress. A few cameras set up in the reserve occasionally captured glimpses of him. "He's doing great," Dr. Mason reported during a phone call. "Hunting, exploring, staying away from humans, he's thriving." Emma smiled at the news, feeling a deep sense of pride. Bruce had come so far, and knowing he was out there, living the life he was meant to live, made all the hard work worth it. One afternoon, as Emma was wrapping up her shift at the construction site, Jake approached her with a curious look on his face. "Hey, you've got a visitor," he said, jerking his thumb toward the entrance gate. Emma frowned. "A visitor? Here?" Jake shrugged. "Looks official. Better go see what it's about." As Emma walked toward the gate, she spotted a man in a uniform standing next to a dark SUV. His badge gleamed in the afternoon sun, and his serious expression piqued her curiosity. "Ms. Carter?" he asked as she approached. "Yes, that's me," Emma replied cautiously. "What can I do for you?" The man extended his hand. "I'm Ranger Collins from the State Wildlife Department. I wanted to personally thank you for what you did for that fox." Emma blinked in surprise. "Oh, well, I just did what anyone would do." Ranger Collins smiled. "You'd be surprised how many people wouldn't. Your actions saved Bruce's life, and his story has inspired a lot of people." Collins explained that Bruce's recovery and release had caught the attention of local media after the clinic shared footage of him thriving in the wild. The story had gone viral, with people praising Emma and her team for their compassion and effort. "They're calling it, the little fox who could," Collins said with a chuckle. Emma felt a flush of embarrassment. "I wasn't trying to make a big deal out of it. I just wanted to help." "That's exactly why it's such a big deal," Collins replied. "You didn't do it for recognition. You did it because it was the right thing to do." As the days passed, the story of Bruce spread even further. Emma received calls from local journalists and wildlife organizations, all eager to learn more about her experience. At first, she felt overwhelmed by the attention, but Jake reminded her of the bigger picture. "Think about it," he said. "If this inspires more people to care about animals or take action when they see one in need, isn't it worth it?" Emma nodded, realizing he was right. She agreed to do a short interview with a local news station, sharing Bruce's journey and the lessons she'd learned along the way. It wasn't just about saving a fox, she said during the interview. It was about recognizing the value of every life, no matter how small. "Bruce reminded me that even the tiniest acts of kindness can have a ripple effect." The interview aired later that week, and the response was overwhelming. Messages of gratitude poured in from viewers who felt moved by Bruce's story. Some shared their own experiences of rescuing animals, while others expressed how the story had inspired them to pay closer attention to the world around them. Among the messages was one from Dana, the wildlife specialist who had helped release Bruce. "I thought you'd like to know," Dana wrote, "that Bruce has officially established his own little territory in the reserve. He's doing great, and it's all thanks to you." Emma sat back in her chair, rereading the message with a smile. The weight of her decision to save Bruce no longer felt like a burden, it felt like a gift. She realized that Bruce's story wasn't just about him, it was about the countless lives that could be changed by his example. That evening, Emma visited the woods near her home, a place she hadn't been in years. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the trees in a warm orange glow, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known before. "Thank you, Bruce," she whispered, her voice carried away by the breeze. The little fox may have been miles away, but his impact would stay with Emma, and everyone he touched, forever. The morning air was crisp as Emma stepped out onto her back porch, coffee in hand. The woods behind her home were alive with the sounds of nature, birds chirping, leaves rustling, and the distant murmur of a creek. She had always lived near the forest but never felt as connected to it as she did now. Bruce's story had changed her perspective on the world, making her more attuned to the small, often unnoticed miracles around her. It had been 6 months since Bruce's release. Dana, the wildlife specialist, continued to send updates about his progress in the reserve. The most recent message had brought a smile to Emma's face. Bruce had been spotted with another fox, a sign that he was building a life for himself in the wild. "He's thriving," Dana had written. "You gave him the chance he needed, and he's made the most of it." Emma often thought back to the day they found him in the mud. The small, fragile creature they had mistaken for a dog had become a symbol of resilience, not just for her, but for everyone involved in his journey. At the construction site, Bruce's story had become a favorite topic of conversation. Jake, who had initially joked about Emma's attachment to the fox, now wore a small fox pin on his hard hat, a gift from one of the crew members who admired his involvement in the rescue. "Any more foxes stuck in the mud today?" Jake teased one afternoon, though his tone was fond. "Not yet," Emma replied with a grin. "But you'll be the first to know if there are." The story had also inspired the company to implement new policies. After Bruce's rescue, Emma proposed a partnership with a local wildlife conservation group to ensure the safety of animals near their construction sites. The initiative had been met with enthusiasm, and Emma took pride in knowing that their work would no longer disrupt the lives of creatures like Bruce. Beyond the workplace, Bruce's story had taken on a life of its own. The viral video of his release continued to circulate online, sparking conversations about wildlife conservation and the importance of small acts of kindness. Emma had received countless messages from strangers who had been moved by the story. Some shared their own experiences of rescuing animals, while others simply thanked her for reminding them of the power of compassion. One message, in particular, stood out. It was from a teacher in a small town who had used Bruce's story as part of a lesson on empathy. "My students were inspired," the teacher wrote. "We've started a project to help local wildlife in our area. Your story made a difference." On a sunny Saturday morning, Emma decided to visit the reserve. Dana had invited her to see the area where Bruce had been thriving, and Emma couldn't resist the chance to reconnect with the little fox who had changed her life. As she walked through the forest, the familiar smell of pine and earth filled her senses. Dana led her to a clearing where a small camera had captured Bruce's recent activity. "He comes through here often," Dana said, pointing to a spot near the edge of the clearing. "Usually early in the morning or late in the evening." Emma knelt down, running her fingers over the soft grass. Though she didn't expect to see Bruce in person, just knowing he was nearby filled her with a sense of peace. "Thank you for bringing me here," Emma said, her voice quiet. Dana smiled. "Thank you for giving him a chance." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting golden light over the forest, Emma stood and looked out at the trees. She thought of Bruce, his journey from the mud pit to the freedom of the wild, his strength and determination to survive. It wasn't just Bruce who had been given a second chance, Emma realized. In many ways, his story had given her one too. She left the reserve that evening with a renewed sense of purpose, vowing to continue the work that Bruce had inspired. Because sometimes, even the smallest creatures can leave the biggest impact.